So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Giulia Mori, and I am coordinating the Migration Seminar Series on behalf of unu-merit and Maastricht University in the Netherlands. The Migration Seminar Series brings together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and others to discuss their work on migration-related topics. Before introducing today's speaker, I would like to go through a few brief housekeeping points. So today's talk will last approximately 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes for discussion and questions from the audience. I kindly ask you to keep your questions until after the presentation. You can either write them in the chat, in which case I will read them out, or use the raise hand function and I will give you the floor. In the meantime, please keep your microphones muted. You are welcome to turn your camera on if you wish, but please note that this session is being recorded for dissemination via our YouTube channel. And on our YouTube channel, you can also find previous recordings from other migration seminars. So let me now introduce today's speaker. We are very pleased to welcome Lorenzo Piccoli. Lorenzo Piccoli coordinates teaching and training activities at the Migration Policy Center in collaboration with the School of Transnational Governance. His research examines the rights and protection mechanisms available to migrant populations, including access to social protection with a particular focus on Southern European countries. He has published widely in international peer-reviewed journals and regularly contributes to international media discussions on migration and citizenship. He is currently writing a book on the dilemmas faced by volunteers providing social services to migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in Mediterranean countries. Lorenzo Piccoli holds a PhD in social and political sciences from the European University Institute. Previously, he was the scientific coordinator of the Swiss National Center of Competence in Research for Migration and Mobility Studies and worked as a research associate at the Global Citizenship Observatory. Welcome, Lorenzo. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Giulia and Melissa, for the invitation. I'm very happy to join you online today. I was actually with some of you in September last year, I think. And I'm always very, very happy to engage with your group of research because you give me so many ideas and stimulations. Which is why I decided to use the opportunity today to distract myself from this book that I've been writing for the last 3 years and try to talk about another research project, which is actually, I would say, an open construction site. So normally I like to present something that is very structured, that is almost finished. And today instead I'm presenting something it's a bit all over the place. And I'm gonna ask for your feedback and comments, and please be cruel because maybe there will be things that do not make sense, and just let me know. But what I'm gonna talk about is something that I had a lot of fun developing, and I'll try to bring different pieces of work that I've been doing together. And the main concept that I want to develop with you is the concept of selective visibility. Now, to do this, I'm going to share my screen. And while I share my screen, I would like to ask you a question. Try to think in your mind, what is the percentage of migrants who live in Europe who are in an irregular situation? So if I ask the question differently, is what is the share of migrants in Europe who are undocumented or irregular? I'm not going to go around the room and going to ask you what you think, but please try to think and come up with 1%. And I'm going to give you the answer, which actually we don't know. We don't know for sure because undocumented people are by definition very difficult to reach. But there have been a few academic studies. One was called Clandestino, conducted 20 years ago. And another academic study more recently concluded, which is called MIRREM, that tried to estimate the number of people who are living irregularly in Europe. And the percentage, again, compared to the total number of immigrants, is actually around 2, 3, maybe 4%. Okay. So that's a relatively small percentage. Now, the reason why I wanted to start with this percentage is because when we ask people in Europe how many irregular migrants there are, we actually see that most people think that irregular migrants far outnumber regular migrants in Europe. This is a survey conducted a few months ago by YouGov, a very reputable organization that conducts surveys in Europe. These are the results for a few countries, but I can assure you that if you look at other countries in Europe, you will find the same results. Now, to me, this is crazy because people get a very basic fact about migration completely wrong, thinking that most migrants who live here are here irregularly. And while, again, we don't know the exact percentage, we can say with absolute confidence this is not true. This is not the only fact that people get wrong about migration. Many of you probably know a poll by Ipsos Mori, which asked people to estimate the number. So this is no longer about the type of migrants, but about the total number of migrants, immigrants who live in their countries. And what we know from this, again, it's a very well-known fact for migration researchers, is that people constantly overestimate the number of immigrants who live in their country. Virtually all of the countries where this survey is run, there is a gap of about 15 or 20 percentage point. And you see the example from Italy, where I work, around 10% of the people in Italy are immigrants, and yet the population of Italy believes the actual number is 30%, and very similar in the Netherlands. Now, I think this is extremely important because, again, people get some basic facts about migration wrong, and I've been thinking about why that is the case and why it should matter. I think it does matter because we tend to focus on some forms of migration and we completely forget about other forms of migration. I'm going to show you something that I guess is very familiar, and those are titles of newspapers in Europe that talk about migration. Now, there is this constant focus on, again, migration as irregular migration or asylum seekers. And once again, I jumped over another visualization, but we do know that the percentage of migration that is about irregularity or even asylum seekers and refugees is actually very small in Europe. But this is, I would say, the only form of migration that the media talk about. I'm going to give you examples of forms of migration and human mobility that are completely overlooked in the political debate. Now, the first one, very biased. I happen to live in Florence at the moment, and I would say the most important social phenomenon with huge social, cultural, economic consequences in Florence is tourism. But tourism is absolutely never politicized. Political parties don't have a position on tourism. They do have a position on migration as irregular migration. Other forms of migration that we completely ignore in public debates, so-called expats or privileged migrants, international students, even though in some countries, including the Netherlands, actually this has become the source of political contestation recently, and digital nomads. So these forms of migration are generally overlooked in political debates, whereas the media only focused on irregular migration and asylum seekers. Now, it might sound like a very banal question to you, but I think it is an important question to ask. Why is it that certain forms of migration are the object of intense political debate, while others remain completely invisible? You might say this is because of the media. I disagree. I don't think the story is so simple, and I'm going to try to convince you that there are other mechanisms that are very important. Now, again, this is research in progress. So if you can take some mental notes and then come back to me at the end of my presentation with comments and criticisms, I would be extremely grateful. I'm going to try to answer this question today and perhaps touch upon a second question, that is, how is it that these distributions of attention are produced, are sustained, and are reinforced over time. And I'm going to propose, again, a very important concept that I call selective visibility. I think selective visibility is what creates biases in how we understand migration. And I think we can only understand selective visibility if we engage seriously with the stories that we tell about migration. Now, the stories that we tell about migration is something that we don't really do a lot of research upon. There is a very big field of research, as you know, on migration narratives. But migration narratives and migration stories are two different things. A narrative is something that happens in at least two different points in time with a clear message. So, for example, migration is good for the economy, migration is a threat for national security, migration brings diversity and diversity is good, or migration brings diversity and diversity is bad. All of these are narratives about migration. Migration stories are actually very specific stories whose interpretation is open-ended. I'm going to give you a few examples of stories about migration from the past. The story of the great emigration from Europe, especially from Ireland, to the United States. Or the story of the boat people who were fleeing Vietnam to reach Europe. All of these are stories that do not necessarily come with a specific message. People can interpret them in different ways. And in my mind, these really become the building blocks for the kind of policies that are then produced. So I think it is important to take migration stories seriously as an object of what we study. And I'm going to try to show you how I've done it in my work. And maybe you will have ideas or recommendations of how we can further extend the study of migration stories. So the first example that I'm going to give you is how migration stories are created through cinema. I love cinema. I love movies. One question that normally I ask people is, how often do they cry when they read a newspaper article? And then I ask them, how often do they cry when they watch a movie? I don't know about you. I'm not going to ask you now because we don't have a lot of time. But it happens to me quite often to cry when I watch movies. Whereas I almost never cry when I read the news, even though most news we read nowadays are extremely depressing. This is to say that movies can be extremely powerful and can have a very strong impact on people. And in my mind, movies can contribute to shape the way in which we imagine things, what I call migration imaginary. I'm going to give you a few examples. These are movies, and I'm sure that you know some of these movies, that we can associate with very different meanings about migration. Think about One Battle After Another, the movie that won the highest number of Nobel Prizes, of Oscar prizes at the Oscars last year. I think 6 or 7 different Oscar prizes. This is a movie that at the end of the day, it's about irregular migration, it's about smuggling, it's about solidarity with migrants. It's very different from a movie that for Italians, for example, it's extremely important, The Godfather. And if you think about The Godfather, at the end of the day, this is the story of what many people would call the process of integration of an Italo-American family in the United States. Now, I'm not going to talk about the other movies in this slide, but I think you get where I'm heading to. I think movies are very powerful instruments for politics for 3 different reasons. Now, the first reason is that they shape migration aspirations. One example I can give you is the movie Io Capitano, which was produced a couple of years ago. And that is a movie that is used by international organizations, including IOM, in many countries in West Africa and North Africa, to talk about whether people desire to leave and to migrate to Europe. So a movie has a very powerful intervention of policy, if you wish. Movies, of course, are very important in public debates. Again, I can give you the same example of One Battle After Another, which was really used to talk about, migration governance in the United States in this very heated context. Or the perception of diaspora communities. I'm not going to give you the Italian example again. You can think of all the movies produced, for example, by Asian communities who moved to the United Kingdom and how movies were extremely important in their representation and their coming together as a cohesive community. So I think we should take these migration stories very seriously because they do have political effects. And the problem is these stories of migration have been studied mostly by people who work on cinema or on communication, but not really by sociologists, anthropologists, and political scientists. So there are amazing studies of these stories that tend to focus on very specific movies or on very specific genre. What I tried to develop over the last couple of years really is a big database that takes the picture at the global level. What do we know about migration-related movies? Now, of course, the challenge was to define what we mean by migration-related movies, and I tried to include in this database all the movies that are about movement across a border. A border can be a border that is international, or it can be a border within a state. So many movies are about internal migration, obviously, where the person changes her or his habitual place of residence. You can access the database online. If you write migration movies database, it should appear, and it's easy to navigate and interact. And the objective for me is to give a resource to everyone to filter in and filter out movies. And there are more than 700 movies in this database running from 1940 up to 2026, up to today. Now, the key message for this discussion today is that when we look at the database, we can see this selective visibility at work, in the sense that the migration movies give a very distorted view of what migration is. I'm going to show you two key findings. The first finding, this is how the database looks when you access it online. I'm not going to talk about how I built the database, but if you have questions on that, please come to me at the end of the presentation. So the first finding is that the vast majority of movies that are about migration take place in specific settings. And those settings basically are the United States of America and countries of Europe. Here you see the distribution of movies per country. I'm going to show you another visualization where you can see the distribution of movies per region. And you can see that the vast majority of movies, again, either in Europe or in North America as a setting. Now, this is very misleading because it contributes to an idea that migration always takes place from the south to the north of the world. And it's kind of a linear process where people want to go to these places. And we know that that is not the case. I mean, if you look at the figures published from UNDESA and the latest World Migration Report, actually there are a lot of other countries and communities where migration happens, either countries where people move to or people from which people move away. But those places are very, very rarely represented in migration movies. Okay, so this is one form of selective visibility, which I call the northbound bias. If you look at migration movies together, you're going to have this impression that migration always happens from the global south to the global north. And this is factually wrong. Now, there is another bias of migration movie that we can see if we look at the themes of movies. And in the database, I code 13 different themes. Some of these are forms of migration, such as forced displacement, labor migration, return migration. And some others are important categories that we use to study migration, discrimination, for example, integration, or smuggling. I'm going to show you one and only one visualization to get a sense of how these different themes evolved over time. Now, it's a big visualization with a lot of information, but essentially here you see how for every decade, the relative frequency of themes changes. The figure refers to every specific decade from 1940 up to the 2020s. And I would interpret this visualization with two main points. One is that there is one theme that has been almost always present over the different decades, and that is the theme of integration. However, especially from the 2000s, we see that there are three other themes that become extremely frequent in migration movies. One is border crossing, another is forced displacement, and the third is undocumented migration. Well, this is globally, but if you do it at the level of Europe, at the level of the United States, you will get the same results. Why I think this is important? Because it contributes to an idea of migration as something that is about crisis, that is about vulnerability, that is about danger, that is about human suffering. All of these forms of migration are very precarious. And while the movies that are about these categories are actually movies that want to be very empathetic most of the time towards undocumented migrants, towards people who have been forcibly displaced, taken together, they contribute to this very biased imaginary of migration when people think of migration as something that is dangerous. And again, if you look at the actual demographic numbers, generally this is not the case. This is more of an exception to the rule. But we tend to focus all our attention on this. Now, I'm going to show you something very, very unscientific that I've done. I asked a software of artificial intelligence, I think this was ChatGPT, give me 10 snapshots of migration-related movies, just to get a sense. And this is the result. And you can see, well, very funny, I had 12 snapshots, not 10. But okay, I accepted it. And most of these snapshots, again, they convey an image of migration as something that is dangerous, that is about exploitation, that is unsafe, that is irregular, that is illegal, there is surveillance. I mean, you get where I'm going. There are maybe 3 pictures that are more positive, right? A family moving, a group of people around the table, and a child looking out of the window on the train. But all the other images really are about migration as something that is essentially about suffering, about crisis. I think this is important. These are the migration stories that we tell. And I think they contribute to explain that figure that I had at the beginning of the presentation, that figure where people think that most migrants are here in Europe irregularly. It's not only because of migration movies, obviously, but it's also because of those stories that we tell. I'm going to give you a second mechanism that I think contributes to these very biased representations, which again I call selective visibility, or a very narrow way of talking about migration. And this is more critical on the role of researchers. So a few years ago, I tried to build another database. I love databases, obviously. I'm obsessed with databases because I think they help identifying trends and patterns. And this time it was a database of places that conduct research on migration. So obviously your center is in there, the Migration Policy Center where I work is there, and then there are another 410 institutes that appear globally. You can access this database online. It's called the Directory of Migration Research Institutions. And you can see a nice map and see all these institutions, where they are, for how long they have existed, and the kind of work that they conduct. Now, I'm not going to say much on this, but the issue, and this is not surprising, but I think it's important to document, is that once again, the vast majority of institutions that conduct research on migration are in Europe and in North America. In this timeline, you don't see so clearly. I think it's much more clear if you look at the map. In the map, you basically have this big red dot over Europe. Actually, there is a huge red dot in the Netherlands where you are, with a lot of different research centers on migration. And some in North America, quite a few in Brazil, because Brazil had a big funding program for research on migration. But very few research organizations in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East. And these are places where there is a lot of migration going on, all kinds of migration, obviously. I think this is important. Once again, I'm going to try to visualize this to show how predominant, the focus from Europe and North America is in this kind of piece of art or Tetris. And here you can see that the blue bricks, the light blue are the research institutes on migration in Europe. The green ones are in North America, and all the others are in the rest of the world. So you probably don't need to look at the themes of research to understand that the migration stories that we tell through research are also very biased. Because most of the research, and again, we knew this already, comes from Europe and North America. And we completely overlook other forms of migration that are important. Now, I need to do more on this, but I just want to give you an idea of what this might mean. So last year, I gave a presentation in South Africa, and I tried to use Claude, artificial intelligence. So again, this is going to be very basic and probably very bad, but I want to give a taste to check what are the research themes based on this database that people work on in Europe compared to those that people work on in different African countries. And again, you can look at this visualization. Please don't cite it because it's, again, very unscientific. But I think it gives a good idea of the fact that we do focus on some issues, and those issues are different from Europe and Africa. In Europe, there is a very big emphasis on integration, interdisciplinarity, ethnicity, and race. Whereas in Africa, you see more attention to forced migration, displacement, human rights, trafficking. But there are also other issues that, in my mind, are extremely important that are completely overlooked, both in Europe and in Africa, and probably in other continents. I'm thinking about free movement areas, thinking of family migration and family reunification. I'm thinking of labor migration. Yes, it is there, but very few research centers focus on labor migration, international student mobility, and many more. So again, I think also the research that we produce tend to reinforce these very partial migration stories. We only look at one part of migration, and we reduce complexity, but we also forget that there are many other forms of migration that then do not make it to public debates. Now, I think I have 10 more minutes. I'm gonna try to keep it short, also because the next part of my presentation is the wars. It's not that until now it was great, but at least until here I had some empirical findings from different projects. The next part is really a sketch. So please be very forgiving as you listen to me now. I think it's important to try and explain why is it that we have this very selective visibility when it comes to migration. And I think very often we put the blame on the media. We think, again, media narratives are very partial, very bad. And maybe that's part of the reason. But I don't think that media narratives take place in a vacuum. In my mind, one big reason for this is the money, as always, and the institutional funding, where governments and international organizations decide to invest. I remember that when I grew up as a master's student, the main topic of research in the field of migration really was integration, multiculturalism, and assimilation. All the debate was around these. Now we see a completely different debate that is, again, about border management, forced returns or voluntary returns, asylum seekers, and so on. Why is it? I think, and again, I say this very cautiously. I'm not sure. I don't have strong empirical data, but I think that's also because institutional priorities changed. And over the last 10 years, we have seen a lot of money going to projects that are precisely on border management, surveillance, asylum seekers, undocumented migration, compared to different issues that were much more present before. And I think that is one of the first things that happened. And then other issues happen, like the media focusing on those aspects. And then when the media focuses on those aspects, and obviously political parties start to focus on those aspects. And I think one good empirical source for verifying this, which I didn't have the time to explore more in detail, is the source produced by Federica Zardo, who is a professor at the University of Krems, who created this other data set, once again, an amazing data set, which is called the MIG Fund database, where there are a lot of information on institutional funding on migration, okay? So I think there is more work to be done in here, but the point is, let's not only blame the media for this. I think a lot happens at the moment institutions decide to prioritize certain issues, and then everyone follows. And I think this is important. I'm going to jump over this part, because we think that oftentimes there are these narratives on migration that are wrong. And the problem is we try to counter those narratives with the same kind of stories. And instead, my point is, if we want to change the narrative, as many people attempt to do, maybe we have to come up with actually different stories about migration. And this would be a way to get out of what I call the paradox of engagement. So a lot of NGOs, a lot of researchers, again, try to correct or provide different information on a given phenomenon. I'll give you two examples. The go-home vans that were used by the government of Theresa May in the United Kingdom more than 10 years ago, essentially inviting irregular migrants to self-deport. It was condemned by everyone, but the problem is, by everyone, by a lot of people in society, but the problem is that people kept engaging with the same stories given by the government, and by engaging with the same stories given by the government made irregular migration even more central in the public debate in the UK. Another example was the horrible sexual harassment cases around New Year's Eve that happened in Germany some 10 years ago, that involved a number of asylum seekers. And again, civil society tried to make the case that asylum seekers, the vast majority of asylum seekers are law-abiding, they don't break the rules, but by engaging with it, they actually made the issue even more prominent in public debates and associated asylum seekers with crime, with sexual harassment, and with other issues. So I'm not sure, and I never want to tell policymakers and NGOs what they should do in their work. But in this case, one very humble suggestion that I have is perhaps let's try to tell different stories instead. And I have a few examples of how people can tell a different story on migration. So, for example, there are journalistic collectives like Lighthouse Reporting that rather than engaging always again with asylum seekers, irregular migrants, try to cover some blind spots and tell a different story. The story they published a couple of weeks ago is called The Visa Empire and really shows how private companies are basically scamming people and taking a lot of money away from people who want to get a visa to travel internationally. We can, of course, create more stories together with migrant communities. And to do that, we need a better system of incentives. Because at the moment, for example, we academics have zero incentives to co-create stories with communities that are affected by policies. I think another way of telling a different story is by changing some of the indicators. And here a great example is what the government of Austria did a few years ago when it moved away from an indicator that was strictly on the number of asylum applications that were processed onto other indicators that measure the labor market outcomes of asylum seekers. Finally, the last example I'm going to give you is bringing to the ground the data that exists, but not many people see. And here I really want to applaud an initiative by the Overseas Development Institute that created an amazing resource online where you can see the contribution of migrant communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, telling another story and showing how migrants, can be essential in moments of crisis. Now, again, this is very work in progress and very partial, but in general, it's an invitation to do a couple of things. And it is to think about the role of visibility in migration governance and where the attention goes, also in terms of the type of migration that is prioritized. Because very often this is completely disaligned from the demographic situation. And I think sometimes it's important to bring this up. I think it's also important to take very seriously the stories in this sense. And stories can be stories that are told by movies, can be stories that are told through music, for example, or theater. And there has been actually very little research on that. I'm not sure what the reasons are. In my case, maybe people don't take me too seriously when I talk about migration cinema, but I think migration cinema is a very powerful political tool. And I think if we do this, we can see that we only tell some stories about migration and we don't tell other stories. I want to finish giving you a very concrete example of the migration stories that people tell. This is the speech, the State of the Union speech of the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. It was delivered in September 2025. As you know, every year, the president goes out and gives a big speech. And for the last few years, obviously, migration was one of the central topics of the speech. Now, you might not have the time to read through these 3 paragraphs now. But when I did, I was very surprised because, again, this is a very clear example of selective visibility. When people from high institutions talk about migration, and you have only one story that comes out, basically, and that is the story of migration, once again, as irregular migration, as asylum seekers. And that's something that, triggers frustration, that triggers concerns. Does this have to be the only way in which we talk about migration? I would argue, maybe migration is also about this in the European Union right now. I'm not saying it's not about these issues, but here we are completely forgetting about labor migration, family reunifications, the contribution of migrants as essential workers, and many, many other things. And maybe as a call to researchers also to be activists sometimes, I think our role is also to remember that there are all these other stories about migration that we can tell. It's our responsibility to tell them. And if we want to do it, we have to take this idea of selective visibility seriously. And we always have to think about what is it that we are making visible with our stories and what are the things that we are making hidden or that we are forgetting. I'm going to stop here. Again, this is all very much work in progress. I will be so happy to hear about your criticisms. Please be as cruel as you want. And if you see me sweating, it's because of the heat. It's not because of the pressure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lorenzo, and thank you for being perfectly on time. I will now open the floor for questions. And again, you can either write them in the chat or you can just raise your hand here on Zoom. So now everybody's clapping, so I don't know if so. Yes, Melissa?
Well, I guess I can start us off since I don't see other hands at the moment. So thanks so much, Lorenzo. This is really, really interesting, and I definitely agree with you, on selective visibility and what we see and what we see where. Maybe to just do a thought experiment, because I do think that visibility to some extent is important. But just following up on some research that one of my PhD fellows did, Tobias Hillenbrand, who you know, and some work that we've done together, I'm actually wondering if visibility is always a good thing. Also, even if it's something that's good, or neutral or whatever. In some of the work that Toby and I did, we did an experiment also just putting out information, very, very neutral information on a specific topic. And we found that by even just talking about the topic of migration, it already made people more negative, right? Even if, if it was very neutral, and then we can talk about framing and all of these different things or what we're making visible and what we're not making visible. But sometimes I actually wonder if we should just shut up and not talk about something, because like if you think about also in nowadays world of social media and things, it's almost that like anything that gains visibility, whether it's good or bad or whatever, seems to get a lot of people with a lot of opinions, right? And it's almost like you're asking for people to have opinions on something as soon as you make it visible. And maybe sometimes we should just like not have an opinion on something or nobody thinks it's problematic. I mean, maybe just as another example, I mean, I'm also, some of you know me, some of you don't. So I am from the United States originally. I live in the Netherlands and I've been working on migration for, over 2 decades. And very often when I talk to local people or just kind of normal people about migration, no one thinks of me as a migrant, but I've been a migrant for decades. And, like highly skilled migrants or migrants from other OECD countries or European migrants or something just kind of fly under the radar on a lot of things and no one has an opinion about it. But I also, on one hand, would think like if I or highly skilled migrants or whatever in the Netherlands got a lot of visibility in the media, I think all of a sudden people would start to have opinions about it where there were never opinions before. And so I ask myself, because I mean, well, you know also that I do visibility around migration and different things, and I ask myself sometimes if we should maybe just be quiet. I don't know. That's just the open question.
Shall I mean, I'm not going to be able to answer, but take this question, or shall we collect a few? Julia, how do you?
As you prefer. I mean, you can also answer this one and then we can move on, but as you prefer.
Very quickly, I think, I mean, it's an amazing comment, and I just completely agree with it. I don't think visibility is good or bad, but I do think visibility is an instrument of governance, and it gets overseen. Because as you can say, a lot of times things can also be done precisely because we keep things quiet under the radar, and that's important. So I don't necessarily think that visibility is good. But I do think that a lot of the work that is done by organizations, institutions, and governments is precisely to make some things visible. And I think there is something there for us who do research on migration in terms of understanding how that happens and how that happens paradoxically sometimes in ways that people maybe don't plan.
Thank you. I think Maria, ma'am.
Yes.
Hi,
sorry. No, excellent presentation. This is really interesting. I think I have here 2 questions. I think relatively to the stories versus narratives, I think it's a bit hard to distinguish, and I think it's hard to distinguish which influences which. So if the narratives influence the stories that are visible, or if it's the stories that influence the narratives. And then I wanted to ask regarding visibility, if you think that social media now plays a different role, and it can influence what is visible because people have the power, let's say, to tell their own stories, but that's also mediated by an algorithm. And finally, I just want to say, relatively to this question from Melissa as well, it also got me thinking about how language is very important here, because if you say immigrant, you get one reaction, but if you say expat, for example, you get another reaction. So I think language is also very important in terms of visibility. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for these comments that are spot on. On the first comment, I personally see stories as the building blocks that people can use to come up with a coherent, overarching narrative. So again, stories, it's just you're basically telling something that happened either to one person or to a collective of persons. With a narrative, you also have a moral message, or you're telling people what is good and what is bad. In the stories, you don't. You just, give basically some facts. And there is a book that came out very recently from Vivian Schmidt, who is a constructivist scholar, who speaks precisely of the differences between these different forms, narratives and stories. And when I read the book, I realized, wow, that we know so much about narratives on migration, also thanks to my colleague here, James Dennison, who has done so much amazing work on the topic, and Melissa and many others. But we actually don't know much about stories, maybe because they don't come with a moral message, but I think they are the building blocks. On social media, yeah, of course, I think that makes in general communication around social issues even more important and more complex than before. But honestly, I cannot really make sense of social media nowadays. So the only thing I can say is, as many of you, I guess, my hunch is that social media is making people and societies even more polarized than they used to be before, and that's very unfortunate. And finally, language, it is very important. And as Melissa said, sometimes, people don't even see some people as migrants. And when you frame something as migration, people automatically get more anxiety or concerns. So I think that is important. And that's also why, I mean, some of the movies in the database, people initially would never associate them with migration. And then, when I explain why, there is a story of a person who changed place of living, then they do associate with migration. And I think that's important. But, sorry, I'm talking for too long. I'm very much against these initiatives from NGOs and academics telling people what language they should use when reporting on migration. Because, yeah, I think it's method, but it just doesn't work because people don't care at the end of the day. But that's my personal take, so ignore it. Actually, I'll take it back.
Thank you. I think Gurbani. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation, Lorenzo. I also wanted to say first that I came across the movie database before and found it very interesting. So it was great to hear more about that from you. And my question is, as a qualitative researcher, I completely agree with your point about choosing which story, like paying attention to which stories we bring to light. But then part of that, in my experience, has been kind of exposing people and their identities to an extent. And I'm wondering, how do we ensure that their stories aren't only shared, but also addressed without making them more vulnerable in the process?
This is such a difficult question, and one that has been haunting me for a few years, in the sense that there is always this tension between voyeurism and being an ally of populations that we are doing research on. I don't think I have a good answer to that. But what I can say is that over the last few years, there have been a few movies, for example, about migration that are made by people on the move, that are really outstanding, that are fantastic. And I think they're actually much nicer than movie made by people like me who have not, cross-border irregularly or in a situation of danger. I think that for movies, for research, I am always very uncomfortable when I have to speak on behalf of migrant communities, for example. As I mentioned in my speech, there are projects. I'm going to give you a very concrete example. There is a project that is done by my colleagues here at the Migration Policy Center, which is called ULEAD. It's an amazing project. I am biased, obviously, but I'm not organizing that project, so I'm not giving credit to myself. It's an amazing project because it brings together researchers here of the university, together with unaccompanied minors, together with high school students in Italy, in Florence. It's amazing. People love it. It creates connections. It helps people to do research at a moment where normally they wouldn't be doing research, at the age of 16 or 17 years of age. What incentives does that project get? None. Zero. It's not, it's not something that institutions appreciate. It doesn't come with any academic reward. So I'm saying all of this to say, oftentimes co-creating things would be the solution, but the problem is that there are no incentives for co-creation. And maybe one way in which we can improve the situation is to push institutions to reward co-creation. This has been done in some projects. So now, for example, for some Horizon projects, co-creation is explicitly encouraged. Anyway, I'm just ranting around, but I'm happy to share the way in which your comments resonate with me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maria?
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's really, really interesting. I think it's a huge, huge task to do it on a global level. I think it's really nice that you have these different data sets as a basis, and I think they complement each other really, really nicely on a global level. But I can only imagine how difficult of a task it is. And then I think also it's so interesting, this question of like, it feels like some stories that they're like a snowball that's getting bigger and bigger, and you cannot, how can you even stop it from going further? So that I think is a really good exercise to think what could be the alternative and what is out there. I just wanted to mention I've been putting together a data set which will also be soon accessible on claims used in public opinion polls about migration. And also I can see that in the last 40 years that the migration has become something that is problematized and is like a problem to be managed, while the number of moral claims has gone down in time. So it really, you can see that the discussion has changed, and also like how in different points of time there's more like negative tone, more positive tone, and so on. And also that the number of claims per survey have been from 1 to 37. So that's really like a difference how wide or like diverse the discussion is about migration. And of course, usually there's a few claims about economic contribution, labor market, integration, multiculturalism, human rights, that it's really like always around these specific themes. And I think it's also interesting in the sense that this like public opinion polls are often talking about something that people want, but actually like what is asked, like I think it's maybe it's an interesting also addition to your work to see it from that perspective, like how the discussion is in the public sphere.
Maria, it's always nice to see you, and this is fantastic. You should send it to me because it obviously gives me much more solid empirical ground for when I develop this further, and I'm really happy to see. Obviously, yes, this research that you've been doing is precisely the kind of material that I need to give more substance. And the other strengths of research that I want to include are those on how media is reported on the media, because I think that also shows quite clearly that this is the direction in which we are going. But once again, I don't think that reporting on the media is, how you say, the chicken or the egg. It comes after other things are done.
Thank you. I think Tahira?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hello, Lorenzo. It was such a great pleasure listening to you after a break of in almost 2 years. And I was really moved when you spoke specifically about the selective visibility. And being from Pakistan, I would particularly like to mention as how this thing has particularly impacted us. Like in case of Afghan migrants, when they were displaced and they sought refuge in Pakistan, we particularly saw this kind of selective visibility, like the media with an initial wave of all those refugees, they presented them as, in a way, the victims of a kind of an aggression. And in the second wave of that all revolution and that all changes, the local media, they presented them in a way as if They were the certain contents which were disturbing the internal stability or the cohesion inside the Pakistan. So you are absolutely right in highlighting the way media plays a very significant role as how the migration narratives are framed and how the migrants and the refugees are viewed by the common people. So it can actually create a positive feeling among the people as well as the negative feeling as well. So this was just a comment. And as a policy practitioner, something which really attracted my attention was that you showed a kind of a map in which you showed the research which is being done in our part of the world, specifically with regard to Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. And these three countries are the top exporters of the workforce right now, especially to the north. So as how we can convince our governments that they should be dedicating more resources so that the workforce they export to the rest of the world, they are skilled and they migrate on those skilled partnerships which are right based and which are dignified for them. Thank you so much.
Tahira, it's wonderful to see you again. Tahira and I, we met at the Migration Summer School a few years ago, and right now, as I'm speaking, we have another edition of the Migration Summer School here in Florence. Yeah, it's always amazing to keep exchanging with you. So I completely take your comment on the representation of asylum seekers and refugees in society. I always say I'm an academic or a researcher because I would be a terrible politician and I wouldn't know how to do things. So I'm not going to answer your question of how we can convince governments to invest more in research on, for example, immigrants. But what I can tell you is that my perception is that there is significant work that is done on this topic also in many countries of Southeast Asia. But unfortunately, it's work that is not done at academic institutions, or it's not frequently done. And the problem is, again, that a lot of the debates that we have in places like these, in academia, are again shaped by research centers that instead are located in Europe and in North America, with the consequence that we continue to reproduce migration as something about integration, as something that is about the arrival of people, rather than the emigration of people. If you look at the publications in academic journals, also in journals about migration studies, a lot of the publications are actually about immigration and immigration governance, and there are very few that are about immigration and immigration governance. So I think this is a problem specifically when it comes to academic research at the global level that is caused by a whole system of inequalities that, of course, we know well. I don't think I'm saying anything that is particularly original, but my very small and really humble contribution is try to document these. So at least we have an argument to go to policymakers and tell them, look, there is this striking inequality in the number of research centers. Might be a good idea to invest more in research centers, for example, in West Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in other places. We try to practice what we preach at the Migration Policy Center. So another thing that we try to do now is we try to produce more research together with people in other regions of the world. And we try to organize events in other regions of the world together with local organizations. This is very difficult to do. It takes a lot of time. Again, there are very little incentives to do it, but it's extremely rewarding morally when it works. Morally, I mean, for the joy of the spirit when it works. So this is the small way in which we try to do it. There is so much more that we could be doing, and I am still in a position of extreme privilege. So I'm definitely, I don't want to say, take example from me, but I think we can first document these things and then try to go against those inequalities. It was a very long answer. I'm sorry for this, but thanks a lot for your suggestions.
Thank you. So I think we're running out of time, but maybe we can take one last question that was put in the chat, and I think you kind of partially answered this question already. So I'll read it out. So it says, "Hello, Lorenzo. Thank you very much for presenting a knowledge work with honesty and humility. Could you perhaps elaborate more on the incentivization, only from the academia side, or also about incentivizing, for example, supporting and protecting migrant communities to be meaningfully involved in co-creation? What does this mean if we want to also move away from the tendency of knowledge hegemony?"
Yeah, thanks again. I'll try to keep it short. It's a very important question. There are a lot of people who have been thinking much more than I have about this topic, including Melissa. So I'm not sure there is a lot that I can say, but there are good examples of how we can take acknowledgement of these inequalities and try to redress them. I'm going to give you two examples that I know. Maybe one is academic journals that, again, recognize that it's much more difficult for refugees, for example, to publish, but also for people who are based outside of Europe and North America. And then they create specific processes to support them in the publication process. And they also create special fee waivers, because for some academic journals, as you know, you still have to pay crazy amounts of money to publish. I'm going to give you another example, which I think is very mundane, but that's precisely why it's a good example. Academic conferences, a lot of conferences. I mean, for me, it's still quite easy to go if I want to go, because I can ask for funding for my organization. Disclaimer, my organization doesn't give me funding to go to conferences, so still a problem for me, but I have the money, I can pay, and sometimes it costs maybe a few €100, but then you have to pay accommodation. Okay. For someone who maybe is a migrant and who lives in, let's say, South Africa, where I was a couple of months ago, it's impossible to participate. So what organizations can do, they can give scholarships. We give scholarships. But then there is another problem, and the scholarship, you receive it oftentimes after the conference. So the person has to anticipate the money, and oftentimes the person does not have the means to anticipate the money. So this might seem like very small and trivial things, but if we don't take these details into account, the people who will continue to, again, come up with the stories that we tell about migration in research, but also in the cultural environment, are still people who are privileged like me, because they can afford to do it. And I think these are small details that we have to take very, very seriously. These are just very small ideas. I'm going to stop here because I know we are vastly over time. You should also ask Melissa and other people who have been thinking very carefully about this and know a lot more about it than I do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lorenzo. Yes, we are slightly over time, but I want to thank you, all of you, for joining us today, and a special thank to you, Lorenzo, for such an insightful presentation. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the recording of today's session will be soon available on the unu-merit YouTube channel. And also another thing is that this seminar concludes our migration seminar series for the summer. So we will be taking a short break over the coming months, and we will be welcoming you back in September with a new series of exciting speakers and discussions. Thank you again for your participation, and we wish you all a wonderful summer. I will see you in September. And Melissa says she's sorry, but the internet stopped working in her office, so she couldn't say goodbye before leaving. But thank you all. Bye.
Thank you so much for your time and for your ideas. Bye-bye.
Bye.